My stepmom turned my childhood room into her yoga studio because my things hold negative energy, so I got her kicked out of every wellness center in town. My stepmom Tanya was 43 going on 23, the kind of woman who called herself a wellness goddess and filmed herself crying for Instagram stories. She married my dad when I was 17, moved into the house my mom left me, and my dad when she died, and immediately started talking about shifting the energy. She'd do yoga in the living room at 5 a.m. with the volume maxed out, burn sage that triggered my dad's allergies, and lecture us about our toxic auras while eating our food. When I left for college, I made it clear my room was off limits. It had my mom's old furniture, my baseball trophies, posters from concerts my mom took me to. Dad promised nothing would change. I came back for Thanksgiving freshman year. My room was gone. White walls, bamboo floors, mirrors everywhere, a meditation corner with crystals, and a sign that said, Tanya's Sacred Space. My bed, my desk, my mom's rocking chair, all stuffed in the garage under moldy tarps. "You're never here anyway," Tanya said, stretching in her new studio. "The universe told me this room needed purpose. Your childhood stuff was holding negative energy." Dad just stood there, spineless as always, mumbling about how I could sleep on the couch when I visited. I spent the rest of break on a friend's floor. But here's what Tanya didn't know. I'd been paying attention to her whole wellness hustle. She wasn't just doing yoga for fun. She was building a business. Private clients at $200 per session, teaching at 3 different studios, running weekend retreats. She was pulling in serious money, all cash, all undeclared. She bragged about it constantly, about how she was manifesting abundance. I went back to school and got strategic. Started following all her social media accounts from a fake profile. Joined the same Facebook groups where she promoted her services. Learned her entire schedule, her client list, her studio affiliations. Then I made friends with Ashley, a girl in my economics class whose mom owned the biggest yoga studio in town, the one where Tanya taught her Wednesday and Friday classes. Ashley's mom, Linda, was a real business owner with actual certifications, insurance, the works. We got coffee sometimes. I mentioned Tanya casually, asked about the yoga community. Linda was chatty, told me about the politics, the drama, the unwritten rules, like how they had a strict policy about not poaching clients, like how they blacklisted instructors who taught at home without proper permits, like how the whole community would turn on someone who violated their trust. Spring break came. I came home to find Tanya had expanded. She'd knocked out the wall between my room and the guest room, making a double studio. She was running 6 classes a week from the house, filming content, treating the whole upper floor like her personal business. "You should be happy," she told me. "I'm successful. That's good for the family." I spent that week being helpful. Offered to assist with her home classes. Took attendance, handled payment, acted supportive. I met all 15 of her regular home clients. Got their names, their numbers, even helped them with poses. Tanya loved it. Thought I was finally accepting her. The week after spring break, things started happening. First, the city got an anonymous tip about an unlicensed business running in a residential zone. Inspectors showed up while Tanya had 8 clients in the house. $3,000 fine. She had to cancel all home sessions immediately. Then, Linda at the main studio got an anonymous email with photos of Tanya teaching those same clients at home, clients who were supposed to be exclusive to the studio. Clear violation of her contract. Linda fired Tanya that day and sent a warning to every studio in town. Tanya was blacklisted from teaching anywhere within 50 miles. But the best part? I'd been talking to her clients during spring break, mentioning this amazing new instructor named Rachel who'd just moved to town. Young, certified, taught a blend of yoga and Pilates. By coincidence, Rachel reached out to all of Tanya's former clients the same week Tanya got shut down. Rachel was actually my friend from college who needed money. I'd coached her on exactly what to say. She picked up 12 of Tanya's 15 clients within 2 weeks. Tanya couldn't prove anything. The city complaint was anonymous. The email to Linda came from a random Gmail account. Her client switching to Rachel was just bad luck. She tried rebranding online, but mysteriously, every time she posted, comments would appear about her teaching without permits and getting fired from studios. Not from me, of course, just concerned community members. Within 3 months, Tanya's wellness empire was dead. I opened Instagram on my laptop, sitting in my dorm room with the lights off. Tanya's face filled the screen, tears streaming down her cheeks in some dramatic close-up shot. The caption read, "Under attack by toxic energy." She was posting 3-4 times a day now, each story more desperate than the last. Videos of her crying, talking about jealous haters trying to destroy her light. Posts about how the universe was testing her, how she needed to stay strong against negative forces conspiring against her success. She'd lost her teaching jobs, her clients, her whole income, and she still thought this was about energy and vibrations instead of breaking the law and violating contracts. I scrolled through her feed, watching her spiral in real time. She was tagging random wellness accounts, begging for support, asking other instructors to speak out about the injustice happening to her. Nobody responded. The yoga community had turned their backs completely. I closed the laptop and went to class, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. 3 days passed before Dad called. His voice sounded worn down, like he'd aged 10 years in a month. Tanya had been crying for weeks straight, he told me. Their savings account was empty, drained by her business expenses and that $3,000 city fine. The mortgage payment was coming up, and they didn't have enough to cover it. He asked if I knew anything about what happened to her clients, why they all left so suddenly. I leaned back in my desk chair, keeping my voice casual and concerned. The yoga community was probably just competitive, I said. Instructors poach clients from each other all the time. Maybe someone offered her students a better deal. Dad sighed, accepting the explanation without question. He never suspected I had anything to do with it. We talked for a few more minutes about school, about my classes, normal father-son stuff that felt hollow and fake. I hung up and went back to studying, pushing away the small flicker of guilt trying to surface. Friday afternoon, I drove home for a weekend visit. The house looked the same from outside, but inside everything felt different. Tanya hadn't left the couch in days, Dad told me quietly at the door. I found her in the living room, wrapped in 3 blankets despite the warm weather, staring at her phone. Empty ice cream containers sat on the coffee table next to her. On the TV screen, some wellness influencer talked about manifesting abundance and positive energy. Tanya didn't look up when I walked in. Her hair was greasy, pulled back in a messy bun. No makeup, no yoga clothes, just sweatpants and an old t-shirt. The woman who used to do sunrise yoga sessions at max volume now couldn't even get off the couch. I said hello. She mumbled something back without making eye contact. Her clean eating philosophy had disappeared along with her business. I could see chocolate stains on her shirt. Dad hovered in the doorway, looking helpless and exhausted. I went upstairs to drop my bag in the guest room, the one that used to exist before Tanya knocked out the wall. Dad caught me in the hallway 20 minutes later, pulling me into his bedroom and closing the door. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped between his knees, and told me something that made my stomach drop. He'd taken out a second mortgage on the house. 6 months ago, when Tanya wanted to expand her studio, he'd borrowed against the equity to pay for the construction, the equipment, everything. Now they were drowning in payments they couldn't make. His voice cracked when he said it. He looked defeated, shoulders slumped, staring at the floor. He finally saw how Tanya's impulsive decisions had real consequences, how her manifesting abundance bullshit had put them in actual financial danger. But even now, even facing foreclosure, he wouldn't confront her directly. He just sat there looking miserable, asking me if I had any ideas about what they should do. I didn't have an answer. The guilt that had been flickering earlier grew stronger, spreading through my chest. I left Dad in his room and climbed the stairs to what used to be mine. The studio space looked different without classes happening. Dust gathered on the bamboo floors. The mirrors reflected empty space. Expensive yoga mats rolled up in the corner, singing bowls that cost hundreds of dollars, sitting unused on shelves. The crystal collection Tanya had spent thousands building lined the windowsill, catching afternoon light. I did the math in my head, adding up everything I could see. $15,000, maybe 20, all sitting here gathering dust while my parents couldn't make their mortgage payment. I walked to the window and looked down at the garage. My mom's rocking chair was still down there under a tarp, wood probably warping from moisture by now. The desk where I'd done homework through high school, the bed frame my mom had picked out when I was 12, all of it rotting in a damp garage while Tanya's useless equipment filled this space. Rage flooded through me again, hot and sharp. She'd destroyed everything that mattered for a business that lasted 4 months. She'd convinced my spineless father to mortgage our house for her ego project. And now they were both paying for it. But my mom's furniture was still ruined, my room was still gone, and nothing I'd done had actually fixed anything. I went back downstairs, planning to leave, but Tanya was waiting in the hallway. She'd gotten off the couch, standing there in her stained sweatpants, looking at me with red eyes. She knew I was holding negative energy about the room situation, she said. Her voice had that familiar spiritual guru tone, even though she looked like she hadn't showered in a week. She suggested we do a healing meditation together, right now, to release the past and move forward in love and light. She pulled out her phone, ready to play some meditation music. I stared at her, amazed that she still didn't get it. The problem wasn't my energy. The problem was her entitled behavior, her complete disregard for boundaries, her convincing my dad to destroy my childhood space and mortgage our house for her vanity project. The problem was Dad's spinelessness, his inability to ever stand up to her or protect what mattered to me. But she just stood there, phone in hand, waiting for me to agree to her healing meditation like that would fix years of disrespect and violation. I told her I had to get back to campus and walked out the door. Monday morning, I met Rachel at the campus coffee shop. She was grinning when I sat down, sliding her laptop across the table to show me her client list. The last 3 of Tanya's former students had signed up over the weekend. All 15 clients had transferred within 4 months. Rachel's classes were full, her schedule packed, and we were splitting the income just like we'd planned. She'd made enough to cover her spring tuition and had money left over for rent. I felt that same cold satisfaction from watching Tanya's Instagram spiral. Her entire business had been transferred to my college friend, every single client, and Tanya had no idea I'd orchestrated the whole thing. We talked about Rachel's classes, about the clients, about how well everything was going. She mentioned that 2 of them had asked about Tanya, wondering what happened to her. Rachel had kept it vague, just said Tanya was dealing with some personal issues. The clients seemed happy with the switch. Better instruction, better rates, no drama. We finished our coffee and headed to class, and I pushed away the growing guilt about my parents' mortgage situation. 2 weeks crawled by with me trying to focus on the school and failing. Then Dad called again. Tanya wanted to sell all her studio equipment, he said. They needed money for the mortgage payments, and she'd finally agreed to let it all go. His voice had a tiny bit of hope in it when he asked if I'd be okay with them converting the space back to bedrooms. Maybe restoring my old room, putting things back how they were. I felt something shift in my chest, a flicker of hope mixing with the guilt. My room could come back. Mom's furniture could come out of the garage. Things could be fixed, at least partially. I told Dad yes, definitely. I was okay with that. More than okay. He sounded relieved. He said they'd start listing the equipment online this week, and once it's sold, they'd begin the conversion. We hung up, and I sat in my dorm room, staring at the wall, feeling something close to optimism for the first time in months. Friday, I drove home again, earlier than planned, wanting to see the equipment being sold and the space being emptied. I walked in the front door and heard Tanya's voice from the living room, that familiar, excited tone she used when talking about her business ideas. My stomach dropped. I found her sitting with her laptop, showing Dad something on the screen. She'd sold half the equipment, she told me brightly, but she'd had a better idea for the rest. Online wellness coaching. She could film content in the studio space, offer virtual sessions, build a digital presence. No overhead costs, no studio rental fees, just her and the internet. She was already designing her website. Dad sat next to her on the couch, and the hope I'd heard in his voice 2 weeks ago was gone. He looked miserable, gray-faced, and exhausted. He'd realized she wasn't actually changing her behavior, wasn't learning anything from losing her business. She was just finding new schemes to avoid getting a real job, new ways to chase the same dream that had already put them in financial crisis. I looked at the studio equipment still sitting in the corner, at Tanya's excited face as she scrolled through website templates, at Dad's defeated expression. Nothing had changed. Nothing was going to change. I waited until Tanya went upstairs to film some content for her new online coaching idea. Then I cornered Dad in the kitchen, keeping my voice low, but letting all my anger show. I told him he'd let Tanya disrespect Mom's memory, destroy my childhood space, mortgage our house, and he'd never once stood up for me. He'd chosen keeping peace with his wife over protecting what mattered to his son. He'd been spineless through all of it, and now we were all paying the price for his weakness. Dad's face went red. He got defensive immediately, saying I didn't understand how hard marriage was, how complicated adult relationships were, how I was too young to judge his choices. But I saw shame in his eyes. He knew I was right. He knew he'd failed me, failed Mom's memory, failed himself. We stood there in the kitchen, the truth hanging between us, and he couldn't meet my eyes. Upstairs, Tanya's voice drifted down as she filmed herself talking about new beginnings and fresh starts. Dad turned away from me and walked out of the room. I stood there alone, rage and guilt and hopelessness mixing together, knowing that destroying Tanya's business hadn't solved anything, and I had no idea what to do next. Tanya's voice cut through from the stairs behind us, sharp and loud. She'd heard everything. She stormed into the kitchen, face red, hands shaking, and started screaming about how I was a spoiled child who couldn't let go of the past. She said I was holding on to material things that didn't matter anymore, that I was stuck in grief instead of moving forward. Then she said my mom would be disappointed in how I was acting, in how I was treating her family, in how I refused to embrace change. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I felt my whole body go hot, my hands curl into fists, and I knew if I stayed there, I'd say something terrible that I couldn't take back. I grabbed my keys off the counter and walked out while Tanya was still yelling behind me, something about toxic energy and spiritual growth. I got in my car and drove straight to Ashley's apartment near campus. She opened the door in pajamas, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside. I told her everything while sitting on her couch, about the fight with Dad, about Tanya hearing us, about what she'd said about my mom. Ashley made tea and listened, and when I finished, she just said I could crash on her couch as long as I needed. The next morning, Linda stopped by Ashley's apartment to drop off some mail. She sat down at the kitchen table with us and mentioned that other studio owners around town had been calling her, asking questions about what happened with Tanya. The yoga community was smaller than I'd realized, and word traveled fast about instructors who violated contracts and broke teaching ethics. Linda said Tanya's reputation was damaged way beyond just the local area. Studios 3 towns over had heard about the blacklisting, about the permit violations, about the client poaching. No one wanted to hire someone with that kind of history. Linda sipped her coffee and said Tanya would have a hard time teaching anywhere in the state now, that the wellness community had long memories about people who broke trust. I felt a weird mix of satisfaction and guilt hearing that. I'd wanted consequences for Tanya, but hearing how completely I'd destroyed her professional life made it feel more real and heavier than I'd expected. Ashley walked Linda out and came back to the couch where I was staring at my phone. She sat down next to me and said something that caught me off guard. She suggested I talk to a therapist at the student health center, said my anger about the room situation seemed like it was about more than just the physical space. I started to argue, to say I was fine, that I just needed my family to stop being terrible. But Ashley kept talking, said she'd noticed how I'd get this look on my face whenever anyone mentioned their mom, how I'd gone completely cold and calculated when planning Tanya's downfall. She said it seemed like I was still grieving, and Tanya taking over my room had reopened something I hadn't dealt with. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, but sitting there on her couch in yesterday's clothes, having fled my own house because I couldn't control my anger, I realized she might be right. I'd been so focused on revenge that I hadn't stopped to think about why destroying Tanya's business felt so necessary, why I'd spent months orchestrating her professional collapse instead of just talking to Dad. I made an appointment at the student health center for the following week. The counselor's name was Dr. Caruso, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm voice that made the small office feel safer than it was. I spent the first session telling her about my mom dying when I was 16, about Dad marrying Tanya too fast, about coming home to find my room gone. Dr. Caruso listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally. In our second session, she asked me what I'd hoped to accomplish by getting revenge on Tanya. I said I wanted her to feel what I felt, to lose something important, to face consequences for her actions. Dr. Caruso nodded and asked if it had worked, if destroying Tanya's business had actually made me feel better. I sat there in the uncomfortable chair and had to admit it hadn't. The room was still gone. My mom's furniture was still damaged in the garage, and Dad was still choosing to keep peace with Tanya instead of standing up for me. The revenge had been satisfying in the moment, watching everything fall apart for her, but it hadn't solved any of the real problems. It hadn't brought my mom back, or restored what I'd lost, or made Dad suddenly grow a spine. Dr. Caruso said sometimes we think revenge will heal us, but it just leaves us with the same wounds plus guilt about what we did to someone else. Spring break came around again, and I drove home, not sure what I'd find. The house looked the same from outside, but when I walked in, Dad was waiting in the living room. He looked tired, older somehow, like the past few months had worn him down. I told him I wanted my mom's furniture moved out of the garage before it was completely ruined. I expected him to make excuses or say we'd do it later, but instead, he stood up immediately and said we could do it today. He looked relieved, like he'd been waiting for me to ask for something concrete he could actually fix. We spent the afternoon loading my mom's rocking chair, my old desk, my bed frame into a rental truck. Some pieces had water damage and mold spots, which made my chest tight with anger all over again, but at least we were saving what we could. Dad had rented a climate-controlled storage unit across town, and we moved everything there carefully, not talking much, but working together. When we finished, Dad locked the unit and handed me a spare key. He said he was sorry it took so long, that he should have protected those things better. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was something real, an actual action instead of empty promises. When we got back to the house, Tanya was standing in the driveway watching us unload the empty truck. She had a strange expression on her face, not angry or defensive like I expected, just confused and maybe a little sad. After Dad went inside, she approached me while I was closing the truck gate. She said she hadn't realized how much those pieces meant to me, that she'd thought I'd outgrown them since I never said anything when she took over the room. She claimed she thought childhood furniture was just stuff people eventually replaced, not things with emotional meaning. The way she said it made something click in my head. I asked her if Dad had told her I'd explicitly said the room was off limits before I left for college. Tanya looked genuinely surprised and said no, that Dad had mentioned I might be fine with her using the space since I was away at the school most of the year. She said she'd asked him if I'd care, and he'd said probably not, that I was focused on my new life at college. Standing there in the driveway, I realized Dad had never actually told Tanya about my boundary. He'd let her think I was okay with it to avoid conflict, then let me blame her for something he'd enabled by lying to both of us. I found Dad in the kitchen making dinner and confronted him right there. I asked him directly if he'd told Tanya I said the room was off limits. He stopped chopping vegetables and stared at the cutting board. After a long silence, he admitted he hadn't wanted conflict with Tanya, that she'd been excited about the studio idea, and he'd thought maybe I wouldn't mind that much since I was only home a few times a year. He said he'd told her I'd probably be fine with it because he didn't want to deal with her being upset. He'd actively lied to keep peace with his wife, choosing her feelings over respecting my explicit request. This betrayal cut deeper than anything Tanya had done. She'd been selfish and entitled, but Dad had deliberately sacrificed my needs to avoid confrontation. He'd let me think Tanya was the villain when he'd been the one who gave her permission, then stood by silently while I blamed her for everything. I told him he was a coward and walked out of the kitchen before I said worse things I'd regret later. The mortgage payment crisis got worse over the next few weeks. Dad called me at the school to say the bank had sent a warning letter about missed payments. He said he'd finally told Tanya she needed to get a regular job, that her wellness dreams weren't paying bills, and they were months behind on the house. I asked how Tanya had reacted, and Dad said she'd resisted for days, crying and saying traditional employment went against her spiritual values, that working for someone else would crush her creative energy. But when the bank threatened foreclosure, she'd finally started applying to places. Dad sounded exhausted telling me this, like he'd aged years in months. He said Tanya had gotten hired at a wellness store downtown, the kind of place that sold crystals and essential oils and yoga mats. $15 an hour, part-time to start. It was the only place that would hire her after her reputation got destroyed. She'd start the following week. I came home the weekend after Tanya's first week at the wellness store. She was on the couch when I arrived, still in her work polo shirt with the store logo, looking completely drained. Her hair was in a messy ponytail instead of the perfect wellness goddess waves she used to maintain. She barely acknowledged me when I walked in. Dad said she'd been like this every day, coming home exhausted and bitter about having a boss and a set schedule and customers who treated her like a retail worker instead of a spiritual teacher. I watched her sit there complaining about how her manager criticized her for being late and how she had to clean the bathroom and restock shelves, and I felt absolutely zero sympathy. This was reality, the thing she'd been avoiding by building her cash business and pretending the rules didn't apply to her. She'd been charging $200 per session, treating herself like some kind of guru, and now she was making $15 an hour folding yoga mats and dealing with difficult customers. The come down was massive, and watching her face, it gave me a cold satisfaction that probably wasn't healthy, but felt deserved. My next session with Dr. Caruso, I told her everything I'd done to destroy Tanya's business. I laid it all out: the anonymous city complaint, the email to Linda with photos, coaching Rachel on how to steal the clients, the coordinated takedown that left Tanya blacklisted and broke. I expected Dr. Caruso to be shocked or disappointed, to lecture me about revenge being wrong. Instead, she just asked questions. Did destroying Tanya's business bring my mom back? No. Did it restore my room? No. Did it make Dad suddenly grow a spine and stand up for me? No. Did it actually resolve any of my feelings about grief and loss and betrayal? I sat there unable to answer that last one honestly. The revenge had felt good in the moment, watching Tanya's empire collapse, but sitting in Dr. Caruso's office months later, I had to admit it had been pointless in the ways that mattered. My mom was still dead, my childhood room was still gone, Dad was still weak and conflict avoidant, and I was still angry about all of it. Destroying Tanya's business hadn't healed anything. It had just given me temporary satisfaction, while the real problems stayed exactly the same. Dr. Caruso didn't tell me I was wrong for what I did. She just asked if it fixed anything that actually mattered. I sat there in her office, staring at the poster about healthy coping mechanisms, and realized the answer was no. My mom was still dead. My room was still gone. Dad was still letting Tanya walk all over him. I'd destroyed her business and felt good about it for maybe a week, but now sitting here months later, I just felt empty. The revenge had been this huge thing I'd planned and executed perfectly, but it hadn't healed anything. It was like eating junk food when you're starving. Satisfying for a minute, then you're still hungry. Rachel called me 2 days after that session. I was in the library studying for finals when my phone buzzed. She sounded weird, her voice tight like she'd been crying. She said she needed to talk about the whole Tanya situation. We met at the coffee shop near campus, the one that always smelled like burnt beans and old milk. Rachel ordered a latte and didn't drink it, just wrapped her hands around the cup. She told me she felt terrible about taking Tanya's clients now that she understood the full family situation. She'd thought it was just some petty drama between me and my stepmom, but after I'd explained everything to her last week, about my mom dying and Tanya taking over my room and Dad being useless, she realized how messed up it all was. She offered to stop teaching those clients if it would help somehow. I watched her sitting there looking guilty and realized she was a better person than me. I told her to keep the business. At least someone was getting something good out of this mess, and those clients deserved an instructor who actually cared about them instead of just using them for Instagram content. Rachel looked relieved and said she'd split the money with me, but I told her no. This wasn't about money. It never had been. Dad called me the next week. Finals were over and I was packing to go home for the summer. His voice sounded different on the phone, quieter somehow. He asked if we could talk when I got home, really talk, not just the surface-level stuff we usually did. I said sure, and hung up feeling nervous. Dad and I didn't do serious conversations. We did sports scores and weather and safe topics that didn't require actual feelings. I drove home on a Saturday morning. The house looked the same from outside, but when I walked in, something felt off. Tanya wasn't doing yoga in the living room. The sage smell was gone. The place was just quiet and normal, like a regular house where regular people lived. Dad was in the kitchen making coffee. He poured me a cup without asking, and we sat at the table. He looked older than I remembered, more tired. He started talking and I just listened. He said he was sorry for not protecting my space and my mom's memory. He said he knew he'd failed me as a parent. Then he told me something I'd never known. After Mom died, he'd been so lonely he couldn't function. He'd go to work and come home and sit in their bedroom for hours, just staring at her side of the closet. When he met Tanya at the grocery store and she smiled at him, it felt like the first time in 2 years that someone saw him as a person instead of a widower. He married her too fast because he was desperate not to be alone anymore. He let her steamroll over boundaries because saying no meant risking being by himself again, and he couldn't handle that. Hearing him say this made me understand his weakness, even if I couldn't excuse it. He'd chosen his own comfort over his son's needs. That was still wrong, but at least now I knew why. I went upstairs after our talk. The studio space looked different. Tanya had tried to start an online wellness coaching business. She'd set up a ring light and backdrop in the corner, filmed herself giving advice about meditation and clean eating and finding your inner goddess. But it had failed fast. Her first client posted a review on some wellness forum saying Tanya charged $200 for an hour of generic advice anyone could find on YouTube. The review mentioned her getting blacklisted from local studios for teaching without permits. Suddenly, every time Tanya tried to post about her new coaching services, people would comment asking about her reputation. Her past caught up with her digital rebrand within 3 weeks. The ring light sat in the corner now, unplugged and dusty. Summer break started, and the house felt completely different. Tanya worked at the wellness store from 10 to 6 every day. She'd come home exhausted, change out of her polo shirt, and collapse on the couch. The studio space was mostly empty, just mirrors on the walls and bare bamboo floors. Her yoga mats were rolled up in the corner. Her crystals sat in boxes. The whole upper floor felt abandoned, like a business that went bankrupt, and nobody bothered to clean it out. Dad asked me one evening if I wanted to help him start converting it back to regular rooms. I said yes immediately. We spent the weekend working on it. Dad rented tools from the hardware store, and we started pulling up the bamboo flooring. It came up in long strips, leaving adhesive residue on the original hardwood underneath. We worked in silence mostly, just the sound of pry bars and wood cracking. Tanya didn't help. She didn't interfere either. She just sat downstairs watching home improvement shows on TV after her shifts, still in her work clothes, her hair in a messy bun. Her whole goddess persona was gone. The confident woman who'd filmed herself crying for Instagram was replaced by someone who looked defeated and tired. Working retail and facing financial stress had stripped away all her spiritual influencer energy. She was just a regular person now, exhausted from standing on her feet all day and dealing with difficult customers who treated her like she was nobody. I found myself watching her sometimes and feeling something I didn't expect. Not forgiveness exactly, but something softer than the rage I'd carried for months. She looked so different from the woman who'd taken over my room. That version of Tanya had been confident and entitled, treating our house like her personal brand headquarters. This version looked broken. I mentioned it to Dr. Caruso during our next phone session. She said empathy doesn't mean excusing someone's behavior. It just means recognizing they're a flawed person who made selfish choices and is now facing consequences. Tanya had violated my boundaries and disrespected my mom's memory. Those things were still wrong. But watching her transformation from wellness influencer to exhausted retail worker, I could see she was suffering too. That didn't fix what she'd done, but it made her seem more human and less like the villain I'd built up in my head. Dad started selling Tanya's yoga equipment online. The expensive singing bowls went first, then the meditation cushions, the specialty mats, the sound system she'd used for classes. He posted everything on Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist. People came to the house to pick things up, and I watched Tanya's face every time someone carried away another piece of her former business. She cried when the singing bowls got packed up, actual tears running down her face. Dad used the money to make an extra mortgage payment. He showed me the bank statement afterward, said they were finally getting ahead of the debt Tanya's business had created. But watching Tanya mourn those singing bowls, I realized she wasn't just sad about losing expensive things. She was mourning her identity. For years, she'd been a wellness goddess, a spiritual teacher, someone who helped people find their inner light. Now she was a retail worker who folded yoga mats for minimum wage. Everything she'd built her sense of self around was gone. Ashley texted me one afternoon saying she'd heard something interesting. Her mom, Linda, had mentioned that Tanya came into the yoga studio last week. Tanya had tried to apologize, asked for another chance to teach there. Linda turned her down flat. Ashley said her mom explained that trust once broken in the yoga community isn't easily restored. Studios rely on reputation and integrity. An instructor who violates contracts and teaches illegally becomes a liability nobody wants to risk. Tanya would need years of rebuilding her reputation before any studio would consider hiring her again. Even then, it would be an uphill battle. The wellness community had long memories about people who broke the rules. I started my sophomore year in August, feeling different from I had freshman year. The anger that had driven me to destroy Tanya's business was still there, but quieter now. I found myself thinking less about revenge and more about what I actually wanted from my family situation. Dr. Caruso kept asking me this question during our sessions. What did I want? Not what did I want to destroy or punish, but what did I actually want to build? I'd spent so much energy on payback that I'd never thought about what would make things better. She encouraged me to write it down, make a list of what a good relationship with Dad and Tanya would look like. I sat in my dorm room one night with a notebook and realized I'd never actually told them directly what I needed. I'd just expected them to know, and when they didn't, I'd gotten revenge instead of communicating. Maybe that was part of the problem, too. Fall break came in October. I drove home and found Tanya in the living room folding laundry from her retail job. Dad was in the kitchen making dinner. I asked them both to sit down because I needed to say something. They looked nervous, probably expecting another fight. I told them exactly how the room situation hurt me. I explained it wasn't just about the physical space. It was about feeling erased from my own home. It was about having my mom's memory disrespected when her furniture got shoved in the garage. It was about Dad promising nothing would change and then letting everything change without even telling me first. I talked for maybe 20 minutes and they just listened. Tanya didn't interrupt to talk about energy or the universe or her spiritual journey. She just sat there and actually heard what I was saying for the first time since she'd moved in. Dad cleared his throat and looked at Tanya, who sat forward on the couch. She twisted her hands together for a minute, then looked directly at me. The apology came out awkward and halting, nothing like her usual smooth wellness goddess speeches. She said she was sorry for taking over my room without asking, for putting her business ahead of my feelings, for treating the house like it was only hers. She admitted she got so caught up in building her brand and her identity as a yoga teacher that she stopped thinking about how her choices affected other people. Working retail for the past few months had been hard, she said, but it taught her that other people's needs actually mattered. She couldn't just manifest her way through life while ignoring everyone around her. I sat there processing this, watching her face. She looked tired and older somehow, without all the Instagram filters and perfect lighting. The apology wasn't eloquent or perfect, but something about it felt real. She wasn't performing for an audience or trying to sound spiritual. She was just admitting she messed up. Dad jumped in then, saying he had an idea about the room situation. Winter break was coming up in a few weeks, and he wanted to spend that time fully restoring my old room to exactly how it was before. He'd already started pricing out paint and flooring to replace what Tanya had installed. Tanya surprised me by offering to help with the restoration work. She suggested we could turn the former guest room into an actual guest space that all three of us shared, instead of it being her personal domain. It seemed like a reasonable compromise, giving me back my space while still having a room for visitors when needed. I looked between them, trying to figure out if this was real or just another promise that would fall apart. I told them both I needed to see consistent follow-through, not just good intentions and empty words. I'd heard promises before that nothing would change, and then I came home to find my room completely gone. Dad nodded seriously and said he understood why I was skeptical. Tanya agreed and said she knew she had to prove through actions that she'd actually changed. For the first time since she moved into the house, I felt like maybe we could build something that actually worked, even if it wasn't perfect. The next few weeks brought some stability to the house. Dad picked up extra shifts at work, coming home exhausted but determined to get ahead of the mortgage payments. Tanya's retail job provided steady income, nothing like the cash she used to pull in from yoga classes, but reliable. They started attending financial counseling together on Tuesday nights, meeting with someone who helped them create a budget and payment plan. Dad told me over the phone that the counseling was helping them communicate better about money and decision-making, that they were learning to actually talk through problems instead of Tanya manifesting solutions and him just avoiding conflict. Winter break arrived and I drove home with my truck loaded with boxes. I'd been to the storage unit where we moved my mom's furniture, and I was bringing everything back. Dad had already started on the room, pulling up Tanya's bamboo flooring and repainting the walls the same blue they used to be. The mirrors were gone, the meditation corner dismantled, all of Tanya's crystals and yoga equipment moved out. We spent the entire week working on the restoration. I brought up my old bed frame from the basement and Dad helped me assemble it. We found my desk in the garage, cleaned off the mold and refinished the wood. My baseball trophies went back on the shelves. My concert posters got carefully hung on the walls. Tanya helped without complaining once. She carried boxes, held things steady while Dad and I worked, even helped clean my mom's old furniture. When she picked up my mom's rocking chair to move it into position, she handled it carefully, almost reverently. She asked me where exactly it used to sit, making sure to place it in the right spot by the window. Watching her treat my mom's things with genuine respect, I could see she was actually trying to understand what mattered to me. The room restoration finished on the last day of break. I stood in the doorway looking at my childhood space fully restored after more than a year. My bed was back in its corner, my desk against the wall where I used to do homework, my mom's rocking chair by the window where she used to sit and read to me when I was little. Everything was exactly how it used to be, down to the placement of my posters and the arrangement of my trophies. That night I slept in my actual room for the first time since Thanksgiving of freshman year. It felt both familiar and strange at the same time, like putting on clothes that used to fit perfectly, but now felt slightly off. I realized that while I'd gotten the physical space back, I'd changed too much to simply return to who I was before all this happened. I wasn't the same kid who left for college 2 years ago. The revenge plot, the family conflict, everything that happened had altered me in ways I couldn't undo just by restoring some furniture and repainting walls. Tanya kept working at the wellness store after break ended, and I went back to the school. She called one evening in January to tell me she'd enrolled in community college business classes at night. She was taking courses on proper licensing, permits, business planning, all the things she'd ignored when she built her first yoga business. She admitted to me that she went about everything wrong before, that she'd been so focused on manifesting abundance that she never bothered learning how to actually run a legitimate business. The classes were teaching her what she should have known from the start. I told her I was glad she was doing it right this time, and I meant it. My next session with Dr. Caruso came in early February. I told her things at home were improving, that the room was restored, and Tanya seemed genuinely changed. She asked me how I felt about the revenge plot now, looking back at everything I'd done to destroy Tanya's business. I sat there for a while, thinking about it. Finally, I admitted I wished I'd tried talking to Dad and Tanya directly first, before I went nuclear with the systematic destruction of her entire livelihood. They needed consequences for their actions. That part was true. Dad needed to stop being spineless, and Tanya needed to face reality about her entitled behavior. But maybe the way I went about it, orchestrating everything to completely obliterate her business and reputation, was more than actually necessary. Maybe there was a middle path I could have taken if I'd been less angry and more willing to communicate. Dr. Caruso nodded and said that kind of reflection showed growth, understanding that revenge feels satisfying in the moment, but doesn't actually solve the underlying problems. Rachel texted me in March, saying she was graduating early and had accepted a tech job across the country. She was passing Tanya's former clients to another instructor, someone established who could give them the consistency they deserved. She told me she was grateful for the money that helped her get through school, but she was also glad to leave the complicated situation behind. I understood that feeling completely. The whole thing with Tanya's clients had served its purpose at the time, but now it just felt messy and uncomfortable. Rachel moving on meant that chapter was finally closing. Spring semester brought a new development that Dr. Caruso recommended. She suggested family therapy, an actual session with a counselor where Dad, Tanya, and I could work through everything together with professional guidance. I was skeptical at first, worried it would just be more empty promises and surface-level conversations. But Dr. Caruso explained that family therapy could help us address the grief, boundary violations, and communication failures that created the whole situation in the first place. I agreed to try it, and Dad and Tanya both said yes when I brought it up. We scheduled our first session for spring break, meeting with a counselor in town who specialized in blended families and grief issues. The three of us sat in that office together, and for the first time, we really worked through what had gone wrong and how to move forward differently. Our first family therapy session happened 2 weeks later, in a small office with beige walls and a couch that smelled like old coffee. The therapist was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes who introduced herself and then asked us each to share why we were there. Dad went first, talking about how he wanted to repair his relationship with me and improve communication with Tanya. Tanya said something about wanting to understand the family dynamic better. When it was my turn, I said I wanted them to understand how much the room situation hurt me and how I felt like nobody listened when I tried to set boundaries. The therapist nodded and asked Dad to tell us more about his decision to marry Tanya. He shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable, and started talking about how lonely he was after Mom died. He said the house felt empty and quiet, and he couldn't stand being alone with his grief. Tanya was bright and energetic and made him feel alive again, so he rushed into marriage without thinking about how it would affect me or what I needed. The therapist asked if he considered how I might feel about someone new moving into Mom's house so quickly. Dad's voice cracked when he admitted he was too focused on his own pain to think about mine. He said he failed me as a father by not protecting my space and my connection to Mom's memory. Tanya sat there twisting her hands together, and when the therapist turned to her, she took a long breath before speaking. She said she felt threatened by my mom from the beginning, competing with a dead woman's memory in her own marriage. She admitted she tried to erase evidence of Mom from the house because seeing photos and furniture made her feel like she could never measure up. The room conversion wasn't really about negative energy. It was about claiming space in a house where she felt like a guest. She said she knew it was wrong, but she did it anyway because she was insecure and selfish. I sat there listening to them both and feeling this weird mix of anger and understanding. When the therapist asked me to share my feelings, I told them how abandoned I felt when I came home to find my room gone. I explained that it wasn't just about furniture or space, it was about feeling erased from my own family. Dad choosing Tanya's wants over my clearly stated boundaries made me feel like I didn't matter anymore, like Mom's death meant I lost both my parents instead of just one. The session lasted 90 minutes, and by the end, we were all exhausted. The therapist gave us homework to think about what boundaries we each needed and what we could commit to changing. We scheduled 3 more sessions over the next month. The second session focused on establishing rules for the house and our relationships. I said I needed my room restored and my mom's belongings treated with respect. Tanya agreed immediately, apologizing again for how she handled everything. Dad committed to being more assertive about major decisions instead of just going along with whatever Tanya wanted. We talked about money too, how Tanya's business expenses drained their savings and put them in a bad spot with the mortgage. Tanya admitted she got caught up in the wellness influencer lifestyle and spent money trying to look successful instead of actually building a real business. She agreed to be more transparent about finances and consult with Dad before making big purchases. The therapist helped us write down our agreements, so we had something concrete to refer back to. We covered stuff like how Tanya would stop using spiritual language to avoid taking responsibility for her actions. When she messed up, she needed to own it directly, instead of talking about the universe or energy or manifestation. Dad promised he wouldn't prioritize keeping peace over doing the right thing, even if it meant having hard conversations with Tanya. I agreed to communicate my needs directly, instead of just assuming they'd figure it out or getting revenge when they didn't. The third and fourth sessions were about rebuilding trust and figuring out how to move forward as a family. It was uncomfortable work, sitting in that office talking about feelings and failures, but it felt necessary. By the end of the month, things at home were different in small but real ways. Spring break came in late March, and I drove home not knowing what to expect. I walked into the house and immediately noticed something new in the living room. Tanya had set up a small corner shelf with framed photos of my mom. There were pictures of Mom and Dad on their wedding day, Mom holding me as a baby, Mom at my little league games. The frames were simple and tasteful, arranged on a shelf with a small plant and nothing else. It wasn't showy or over the top, just a quiet acknowledgement that Mom was part of this house's history. I stood there looking at the photos for a long time, feeling something tight in my chest loosen. Tanya came out of the kitchen and saw me standing there. She walked over and stood next to me, looking at the photos too. She said she'd been thinking about what I said in therapy, about how erasing Mom's memory made me feel erased too. She told me she was learning that honoring the past doesn't diminish the present, that she could make space for Mom's memory without feeling threatened by it. I thanked her and meant it. She nodded and went back to the kitchen, leaving me alone with the photos. Later that evening, Dad asked if I wanted to get lunch the next day, just the two of us. We went to this diner we used to go to when I was in high school, sat in a booth by the window and ordered burgers. Dad looked different somehow, more present and less worn down. He told me he was proud of how I advocated for myself, even though my methods were extreme. He said watching me fight for what mattered taught him that he needed to do the same. He'd been setting better boundaries with Tanya about major decisions, making sure they discussed things before she acted. He admitted he'd spent years being passive because conflict scared him after losing Mom, but he was working on being braver. We talked for over an hour, really talked, in a way we hadn't since before Mom died. He asked about school and my classes, and actually listened to my answers instead of just nodding along. It felt like having my dad back after years of him being physically present, but emotionally checked out. 2 weeks after spring break, Tanya came home from work with news. She'd been promoted to assistant manager at the wellness store. The raise was small, but the title meant something to her. She talked about it over dinner, explaining the new responsibilities and how she'd have to learn inventory management and employee scheduling. It wasn't glamorous, and it definitely wasn't the lifestyle she'd imagined when she was pulling in $200 per session, but she seemed genuinely proud. She told me she was thinking about eventually opening another yoga studio, but this time she wanted to do everything legally and properly. She was taking business classes, learning about permits and insurance and proper accounting. She said she wanted to build something real instead of just chasing the appearance of success. I told her that sounded like a good plan, and I meant it. Watching her work a regular job and study business fundamentals felt like proof she was actually changing, not just performing change to make the therapy sessions go smoothly. But sitting in my next session with Caruso in early April, I realized I had a problem. Things were improving at home, Tanya was working hard and respecting boundaries, Dad was stepping up and being more present. We were building something functional and maybe even good, and I was sitting on this massive secret about what I'd done to destroy Tanya's business. Every time we had a good family moment, I felt this weight of knowing I'd systematically dismantled her livelihood through calculated deception. Caruso asked me what was bothering me, and I told her everything, about the guilt that was growing as our relationship improved. She listened, and then asked me what I thought I should do. I said I didn't know, that telling them might destroy all the progress we'd made. She pointed out that real trust can't be built on lies, that honesty was necessary even if it was painful. She helped me think through how to tell them, what to say, and how to prepare for their reactions. We spent the whole session planning the conversation, and by the end, I knew I had to come clean, even though it terrified me. I waited until my next visit home in late April. I asked Dad and Tanya if we could have dinner together, just the three of us, because I needed to tell them something important. They agreed, and Tanya cooked pasta, her specialty from before she got into clean eating. We sat at the kitchen table, and I could feel my heart beating hard in my chest. I started by saying I needed to be honest about something I'd done, that it had been weighing on me, and I couldn't keep lying. Then I told them everything. I explained how I'd called the city inspector with the anonymous tip about the unlicensed business. I described sending the email to Linda with photos proving Tanya was teaching her studio clients at home. I admitted to coaching Rachel on what to say to Tanya's clients and coordinating the whole client exodus. I walked them through every step of my plan to destroy Tanya's business, how I'd spent months setting it up and executing it perfectly. Dad's face went pale as I talked. His mouth opened like he wanted to interrupt, but no words came out. Tanya sat completely still, fork frozen halfway to her mouth, just staring at me. When I finished, the silence in the kitchen was heavy and awful. Dad finally spoke, his voice shaky, asking if I was serious. I nodded and said yes. I did all of it because I was angry about the room and wanted her to face consequences. Tanya set her fork down carefully and stood up from the table. She said she needed time to process this and walked out of the kitchen. I heard her footsteps going upstairs and then the bedroom door closing. Dad and I sat there alone. He looked at me like he didn't know who I was. He asked me how I could do something like that, how I could be so calculating and cruel. I tried to explain about the anger and the grief and feeling powerless, but he cut me off. He said he understood I was hurt, but what I did was wrong on every level. I'd lied to their faces for months, destroyed Tanya's business and reputation, and manipulated everyone involved. He said he was disappointed in me in a way he'd never been before. That hurt worse than I expected. We didn't finish dinner. I went to my room and Dad stayed in the kitchen. I could hear him moving around down there, the sounds of dishes being washed, cabinets opening and closing. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd just destroyed everything we'd built in therapy by trying to be honest. Tanya came to my room the next morning while Dad was at work. She knocked, and I told her to come in. She sat on the edge of my desk chair and looked at me for a long time before speaking. She said she was angry about the deception, really angry, and it would take time for her to trust me again. But she also said she understood why I did it. She admitted she deserved consequences for taking over my room and disrespecting my boundaries. She said she wished I'd confronted her directly, instead of destroying everything she built, but she got why I felt like revenge was my only option when nobody was listening to me. She told me she was processing everything and we'd need to talk more, but she didn't hate me. Then she left, and I sat there feeling this confusing mix of relief and guilt. Dad was harder. He came home from work that evening and asked me to sit with him in the living room. He said he'd been thinking all day about what I told them. He was more upset about the lying and manipulation than Tanya was. He said watching me systematically destroy someone's life through deception scared him because that level of calculation wasn't normal teenage anger. I tried to defend myself, but he stopped me. He said I learned deceptive behavior partly from watching him avoid conflict through dishonesty. He admitted he'd lied to me about the room being off limits, lied to Tanya about what I wanted, lied to both of us to keep peace instead of dealing with problems directly. He said his parenting failures contributed to my choices, and he had to sit with that uncomfortable truth. We talked for over an hour about honesty and manipulation and how we both needed to do better. It was one of the hardest conversations we'd ever had, but also maybe the most real. Our next family therapy session happened 3 days later, and the tension in that beige office was thick. The therapist could tell something had shifted and asked what happened since our last session. I told her I'd confessed to destroying Tanya's business. She nodded slowly and asked how everyone was feeling. Dad went first, talking about his disappointment and fear about my capacity for deception. Tanya shared her anger mixed with understanding. I explained the guilt that had been eating at me and why I felt I had to come clean. The therapist listened to all of us and then pointed something out that hit hard. She said everyone in our family had used avoidance and indirect methods instead of honest communication. Dad avoided conflict by lying about boundaries. Tanya avoided accountability by using spiritual language. I avoided direct confrontation by orchestrating secret revenge. We were all guilty of the same fundamental problem, just expressing it in different ways. She said we needed to break that pattern going forward, that real family relationships required direct honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. We spent the rest of the session talking about how to communicate better, how to address problems before they exploded into crises. By the end, we'd agreed to keep working on it, to try being honest even when honesty was hard. It wasn't a magic fix, and the tension didn't disappear, but it felt like maybe we were finally dealing with our problems instead of just avoiding them in increasingly destructive ways. I spent the next few days waiting for Tanya to process everything. She came home from her retail shifts looking exhausted, reheating leftovers and going straight to bed without much conversation. Dad kept checking on both of us, trying to gauge if we'd survive this as a family or if my confession had permanently broken something. The tension stretched thin, but didn't snap. 3 days after I told them everything, Tanya knocked on my door and asked if we could talk. We sat in the living room and she told me something I didn't expect. She said my revenge plot hurt, definitely, but it also forced her to see how entitled and self-centered she'd been acting. She admitted that losing everything made her stop and really look at herself instead of just posting inspirational quotes about manifesting abundance. She said working retail and facing actual consequences taught her more about being genuine than all her wellness training combined. She wasn't excusing what I did, but she understood why I felt revenge was my only option when nobody was listening to my needs. The conversation lasted over an hour, and by the end, we'd agreed to try something different. Dad joined us, and we wrote out a new family agreement together. Direct communication about problems instead of avoiding them. Respect for boundaries, both physical space and emotional limits. Honoring the past, especially Mom's memory, while still building a present that worked for everyone. We wrote it all down on a piece of paper and posted it on the fridge with magnets, making it real and visible instead of just empty promises. It felt awkward and formal, but also necessary, like we needed something concrete to hold ourselves accountable. Sophomore year wrapped up a few weeks later. I took my finals, packed up my dorm, and realized something had shifted. My relationship with Dad and Tanya wasn't perfect, and probably never would be, but it felt honest now. Functional. We could talk about problems instead of letting them build into crises. Dad called me regularly just to check in, not because something was wrong. Tanya texted occasionally about random things, trying to build an actual relationship instead of just existing in the same house. It wasn't the family I had before Mom died, but it was something real, and that felt like an actual achievement worth recognizing. Summer break started, and I came home to find Tanya studying for her yoga teacher certification renewal. She'd let it lapse after everything fell apart, but now she was doing it properly, going through all the official channels and requirements. She asked if I'd help her study, and I said yes. We spent evenings going through practice questions and discussing proper business licensing procedures. She was learning about permits, insurance, tax reporting, all the things she'd ignored before when she was too busy manifesting abundance. Watching her do everything right this time felt good. I was supporting her legitimate efforts instead of sabotaging them, and that change meant something about both of us growing past where we'd been. Dad and Tanya celebrated their 5th anniversary in July with a small dinner at home. They invited me to join them instead of treating it like a couples-only thing. Tanya gave a toast that actually sounded genuine, thanking both Dad and me for not giving up on the family even when things were terrible. She acknowledged how close we'd come to falling apart completely and how grateful she was that we'd chosen to work through it instead. Dad squeezed my shoulder during the toast, and I realized we'd somehow managed to build something that felt like actual family instead of just people living in the same house and avoiding conflict. Junior year started in late August. I moved into a new dorm room and felt different from I had the previous 2 years. Dr. Caruso had helped me understand something important over the summer. She said my mom would want me to build a good life, not spend years fighting battles that kept me stuck in the past. That didn't mean forgetting Mom or pretending Tanya's actions were okay, but it meant choosing to move forward instead of staying angry forever. I started classes with a clearer sense of who I was, beyond my grief and anger, and that shift changed how I approached everything. October brought news that Tanya had found a small rental space across town for a yoga studio. She kept her retail job for stable income and planned to teach evening classes, building her business slowly and legally this time. She showed me the lease agreement, the business license application, the insurance paperwork, all the things she'd skipped before. Dad and I drove out for her grand opening on a Saturday morning. The studio was tiny compared to her illegal home setup, just one room with basic equipment, but it was hers, and it was legitimate. We stayed for her first class, watching her teach with genuine care instead of just performing for Instagram. Supporting her felt right this time because she'd earned it through actual change and accountability. Ashley and I grabbed coffee a few weeks later, still close friends despite everything that had happened with her mom's studio. She mentioned that Linda had been hearing good things about Tanya's new place. The yoga community was noticing that Tanya had changed her approach completely, operating with real integrity now, instead of cutting corners and violating contracts. Her reputation was rebuilding gradually, not through manipulation or fake personas, but through consistent, ethical behavior. Ashley said Linda might even consider letting Tanya teach at her studio again eventually, once enough time had passed and trust could be rebuilt properly. Thanksgiving break arrived, and we had dinner in my restored childhood room, all 3 of us sitting on Mom's furniture that we'd saved from the garage. Tanya shared stories about her business students and the customers she helped at the retail store. Dad talked about work projects and his therapy progress. I discussed my classes and plans for next semester. The conversation flowed naturally, nobody performing or avoiding difficult topics, just 3 people who'd been through something hard together and come out functional on the other side. It felt like we were becoming a real family, instead of just people connected by marriage and obligation. I thought about the whole journey during that dinner, watching Tanya laugh at one of Dad's stories. Destroying her first business had been satisfying in the moment, but ultimately empty. The revenge didn't heal anything or bring Mom back or fix the real problems. Helping her build a legitimate second business felt meaningful in a way revenge never could. Dr. Caruso had said this showed real growth, understanding that revenge doesn't heal wounds, but honest connection and accountability do. Sitting there with both of them, eating turkey and passing dishes around Mom's old table, I finally understood what she meant. The satisfaction wasn't in watching someone suffer consequences, it was in building something honest together after everything had fallen apart. Dad caught me packing my car the Sunday before I headed back to campus, his hand on my shoulder steering me toward the backyard where we could talk privately. He looked different somehow, standing straighter maybe, or just less tired around the eyes. He told me he'd refinanced the mortgage last week, got better terms now that Tanya's income was stable and predictable instead of the chaotic cash flow from her old business. The monthly payments were lower, they had breathing room again, and he'd even started putting money into savings for the first time since Mom died. Then he said something that actually surprised me. He'd been seeing a therapist on his own, not just the family sessions, working on why he always avoided conflict and put other people's comfort ahead of doing what was right. He admitted he'd failed me when Tanya took over my room, that he should have stood up for me instead of hoping the problem would somehow resolve itself. His voice cracked a little when he said he was trying to become the father I deserved, the one Mom would have wanted him to be. I hugged him, feeling the weight of years of resentment start to lift, and told him I was proud of him for doing the work. We stood there for a minute, neither of us great at emotional moments, before he squeezed my shoulder and headed back inside. Tanya found me later that afternoon while I was loading the last boxes into my trunk. She handed me a card, the kind with a blank inside, and told me to open it when I got back to the school. I opened it right there instead, impatient and curious about what she could possibly have to say. The front had some generic message about gratitude and second chances, but inside was a photo I'd never seen before. My mom, maybe 30 years old, sitting in the rocking chair that used to be in my room. Someone had professionally restored it, fixed the faded colors and water damage, put it in a nice frame. The back had a note in Tanya's handwriting saying she'd found it in a box in the garage, tucked under some old blankets, and wanted me to have it. My eyes got hot and wet before I could stop them, tears rolling down my face as I stared at my mom's smile. Tanya stood there awkwardly, then said she knew she could never replace my mom and shouldn't have tried to erase her from the house. She said she understood now what mattered to me, that it wasn't about the physical stuff, but about keeping my mom's memory alive and honored. I managed to say thank you, my voice rough, and she nodded before walking back inside, giving me space to pull myself together. The drive back to campus felt different this time, lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying rocks in my chest for years, and someone had finally removed them. I thought about everything that had happened since Thanksgiving freshman year, the anger that had consumed me when I saw my room converted into Tanya's studio. That rage had driven me to systematically destroy her business, to orchestrate her blacklisting and client theft with cold precision. But sitting in therapy with Caruso over the past year, working through the grief and betrayal, I'd started to understand that revenge hadn't actually healed anything. It had felt satisfying in the moment, watching Tanya's empire collapse, but it hadn't brought my mom back or restored what I'd lost. The real change, the actual healing, had come from honest communication and setting healthy boundaries. From telling Dad and Tanya directly what I needed instead of manipulating events from the shadows. From holding them accountable while also giving them room to grow and change. I'd learned that the temporary satisfaction of secret payback couldn't compare to building something real and functional together. My room was restored now, filled with my mom's furniture and my own belongings, a space that honored both the past and the present. My family was functional, not perfect, but honest, working through problems instead of avoiding them. Dad was in therapy, learning to stand up for what mattered. Tanya was building a legitimate business and respecting boundaries. And I'd learned the hardest lesson of all, that real resolution comes from confronting problems directly rather than through elaborate revenge schemes. Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same, and I was finally mature enough to choose the harder path of honesty over the easy satisfaction of secret destruction. I pulled into my campus parking lot feeling ready for whatever came next, knowing I had the tools now to handle conflict without resorting to manipulation. The anger was gone, replaced by something stronger and more useful, a commitment to building honest relationships, even when it required difficult conversations and uncomfortable truths.